All right. Today we're going to look at types of proverbs found in the Proverbs of Solomon. And before we do that, I just want to give a brief outline of the entire book of Proverbs. So, as we've just completed chapters 1 to 9, uh, basically that's an introduction to Proverbs with the um, two calls of either wisdom and folly. So that's kind of the main theme of Proverbs chapter 1 to 9. And then Proverbs chapter 10 to chapter 22:16 are the first collection of Solomon. Sorry, that's a hard word to say. Solomonic Proverbs, those that are credited or attributed to Solomon. The next section is chapter 22, verse 17 to the end of chapter 14. That is the sayings of the wise. And then Proverbs 25 to 29 is a second collection of Solomonic Proverbs collected by Hezekiah. Proverbs 30 consists of the words of Agur. Proverbs 31, 1 to 9 are the words of Lemuel. And then Proverbs 31, verses 10 to 31 is the wife of noble character. And that part of the chapter also serves as the conclusion of Proverbs. So that's the overview of Proverbs. So now let's look at the different types of Solomonic Proverbs. We are looking at the Proverbs covered in 10 verse 1 to 22 verse 16, as well as those in 25 to 29. They all have a common kind of way in which they're expressed, and they can be categorized into 6 different types: antithetical, synthetic, synonymous, parabolic, integral, and comparative. And we're going to look at each of those and give you an example of those. So the antithetical proverbs, they have 2 contrasting statements. We could also call them contrasting proverbs. They are by far the most common proverb found in these collections. And let me give you a few examples. Proverbs 10:1 says, "A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son brings grief to his mother." And then in verse 2, we read, "Ill-gotten treasures are of no value, but righteousness delivers from death." And verse 3, "The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the cravings of the wicked." And you see, they're contrasting. And very often in this case, the word but is involved. And so while most of the Proverbs of Solomon are 2 lines, the way in which they relate to each other is different. The most common, following the concept of folly versus wisdom, is that one will either be a positive statement, and that will contrast with a negative, or the first is a negative statement and the second is positive. But what's common in all of them is that they are saying the opposite things. They're contrasting each other to make a point. So that's the first type. The next type, and I'm going chronologically in the order that they appear in Proverbs, not by how often we experience them, are the synthetic Proverbs. They place 2 apparently different thoughts together to draw attention to a similarity that is not readily obvious. They could also be called paradoxical Proverbs. So in Proverbs 10:10 we read, "He who winks maliciously causes grief, and a chattering fool comes to ruin." So what is contrasting here, and seems to be saying an opposite message, is that what you're seeing is that if you are quiet and being sneaky, you cause grief. But also, if you're chattering, you also come to ruin. So the thing that's different is, in one, it's withholding information that is evil, and in the second, it's gossiping that's evil. But what's underlining both of them is a negative intent. Let's look at another one found in verse 18. He who conceals his hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. You see the same thing here. Um, they seem to be saying the opposite things, and yet paradoxically, there is a truth that's common in both. There are times when it is foolish to conceal a matter, and there's also times when it's foolish to speak, in this case, when it involves slander. Proverbs 13:7 says, one person pretends to be rich, yet has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. And the message here is that um, we have to be careful by judging by outward appearances because people may have reasons to conceal their wealth. They may also have reasons to act as if they're more wealthy than they actually are. So in both cases, we need to be careful that we're not fooled by appearances. Proverbs 26:4 is a very interesting one. And 5, it says, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be just like him yourself. And verse 5 says, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. So what is being said in this proverb here is there's danger in keeping silent in the presence of a fool, but there's also a danger in answering a fool because and so you need to use wisdom in order to respond properly. And what is being said here, you need to look at the situation as to whether or not it's worth responding or not. So the next type of proverb is the parabolic proverb. Proverbs that use word pictures to convey the point of the proverb. They could also be called pictorial proverbs. I'll give you some examples here. Proverbs 10:26. As vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to those who send him. Someone who's lazy, if you have to depend on somebody who's lazy, you're in for trouble. And the picture, there's two pictures here. Vinegar and that feeling in your mouth. In the Hebrew, it talks about how it affects your teeth. Different languages express it a different way, but it's not comfortable. Or smoke in the eyes. Or, here's another one. Like gold in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who lacks discretion. So here we see that beauty is likened to a gold ring in a pig's snout. In other words, if you don't have discretion, beauty isn't very valuable. Like cold water to a weary soul, we read in Proverbs 25:25, is good news from a distant land. 25:26 says, like a muddling spring or a polluted well is a righteous man who gives way to the wicked. And so we see in these proverbs pictures being used to help make the point. All right, the next type of proverb is the synonymous proverb, where both lines of the proverb say the same thing in a slightly different way. So for example, we have a generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. So rather than contrasting like the previous proverbs, these say the same thing in a slightly different way. Proverbs 11:29 says, he who brings trouble on his family will inherit only wind, and the fool will be the servant to the wise. So, making a similar statement in two different, slightly different ways. In verse 30, we read, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins a soul is wise. Again, both making a positive statement. And in verse 15:30, we read, a cheerful look brings joy to the heart, and good news gives health to the bones. So we see the same thing being said in different ways. The next type of proverb is a comparative proverb. Comparative proverbs compare two things where one is better than the other. The word better, just as in the contrasting proverbs, but is used. Here we see the word better is almost always found in these proverbs. So, as we see in 11:31, if the righteous receive their due on earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner? Or better to be a nobody, as it says in 12:9, and yet have a servant than to pretend to be somebody and have no food. And here we see a similar proverb about somebody who's putting on airs versus somebody who actually has something. So better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great wealth with turmoil. And the last one, as an example, there's many others. 15:17 says, better a meal with vegetables where there is love than a fatted calf with hatred. So the last type of proverbs is the integral proverbs. And in these proverbs, the second line completes the thought of the first line. So in verse 13:23, we read, a poor man's field may produce abundant food, but injustice sweeps it away. So you don't know, you don't have a complete idea about what the proverb is trying to say until it finishes the second part. So in verse 14:7, we read, stay away from a foolish man, for you will not find knowledge on his lips. So that's saying why you should stay away from the foolish man. And in verse 15:3, our last example, the eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch on the wicked and the good. So in the first part, it tells us that the eyes of the Lord are everywhere. In the second section, we're seeing why that's significant, and that's keeping watch over both the wicked and the good. So the Solomonic Proverbs are usually two lines in parallel, and they complete in each of these six ways. So that covers a good chunk of the Proverbs, but we're going to look at some of the other Proverbs next week.